Great. And 1 second. Sorry. Hi, Danny. Yes, this is Karina. Apologies. Fantastic. Okay. So welcome everybody to this Brownbag session, where we will be discussing the latest IPCC report, impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. And thank you so much to Brandon Abdenor for leading us in this session. We are very grateful to be able to unpack this really important moment in the conversation. And I think for many of us, it's often the release of these reports is very difficult because it brings a lot of really difficult news, but also a lot of hope and solutions. So hopefully we can discuss a combination of those two things today. I'm going to hand over to Brandon now, and then we'll have some time at the end for some question and discussion. Great. Thanks, Brandon.
Thanks, Karina. Hi, everyone. Good to be here. It's nearly 6 months since we had the last brown bag when the last IPCC report was released. And I certainly know that I've used the findings from that report quite extensively in my work, and I've seen some of my colleagues doing the same. So let's see if this report can offer something similar. It is slightly different in approach, which I hope will be revealed as we go along. Okay, just to contextualize, so this report is part of a group of reports that make up what they call the 6th assessments report cycle from the IPCC. The first one from August was the physical science basis, so that literally looked at the scientifically based results from climate change, human-caused global warming. The second one looks at impacts, adaptations, and vulnerability. And the third one on mitigation is expected to be released next month. So that's obviously a lot closer in time. And we'll probably do something similar at that time too. And then at the end, there is going to be a synthesis report, which I think takes the key aspects from all of these and puts them together to chart the way forward. This is a bit of an activist graphic, just to give you an idea of the time frame. So the first assessment report came in 1990, and there you can see certain milestones in the global climate diplomacy that's happened. And the underlying thing to note is that the greenhouse gas emissions have continued to rise, and the temperature has continued to rise. So I think that just shows us that the best science in the world is not going to achieve what needs to be done by itself. But at the same time, it informs what we need to do. And that is to act and stop global warming now. So for this report, there were 270 authors and another 575 contributing authors. 34,000 scientific papers from around the world were reviewed. So this report's not based on people sort of doing the science directly, but they look at the global literature on the subject and draw the most important things together to then create this big picture that the report has done. And then also over 62,000 review comments. So once they start doing the work, it then gets submitted back to the scientific community, if you like, who then comment, criticize, etc. And so the science kind of grows and evolves even in the making of the report. 67 countries were involved, and this is supposedly an evolution and an improvement, but 41% of the authors were women, and 43% of the authors came from developing countries. So those are improvements from what was, and starts to already hint at the social justice aspect of this particular report. So if one looks on the IPCC website, one can download the full report. That's 3,600 odd pages. Or the summary for policymakers, that's 37 pages. Now, what is interesting to note here is that the full report needs to capture, there's some very strict rules around this report, needs to capture everything that is written in the papers that it's covering. But the summary for policymakers goes to the governments to approve. So it switches, you can see here, from the strictly scientific to the political, and all of the governments need to actually agree on what ends up in that summary for policymakers. And as you can imagine, from 3,600 pages to 37, it's going to be that summary that tends to get looked at a lot. So a lot of the gems that might be in the full report might not make it to the summary for policymakers. An example which we will touch on later, hopefully, is the issue of degrowth. So the intentional reduction of GDP linked to greenhouse gases, which I think a lot of us in these circles probably understand is quite an important way of thinking, or something that we at least need to be open-minded to, but something that governments per se, as you can imagine, would not be that happy with. So degrowth is in the full report 37 times. It's not in the summary even once. And there'll be other aspects like that too. So the report, as it always does, has spawned a number of cartoons. They tend to be quite funny and heartbreaking at the same time. And this one just shows this whole issue of inequity and injustice, how many of the decision makers sit in a very kind of certain levels of society that they personally don't need to worry that much on a day-to-day basis about climate change, making decisions for the majority who stand to suffer the most from the impacts. So the sixth assessment report, this is now wording from the report, highlights adaptation solutions which are effective, feasible, and conform to principles of justice. And it breaks justice down as distributive justice, so that allocates the burdens and the benefits among individuals, nations, and generations. Procedural justice, who decides and participates in decision-making, and recognition, which entails basic respect and robust engagement with and fair consideration of diverse cultures and perspectives. So I'm not sure it's the absolute best definition of the different kinds of justice falling under climate justice overall, but it's good to see that it's there and being thought of in these terms. Yesterday, there was a presentation at the Presidential Climate Commission, and a question was asked there: why is it taking us so long to respond? And the co-chair of this working group that produced this report, Dr. Deborah Roberts, she is from Durban and has worked for the Durban City Council for decades, but is also the co-chair of this working group, gave the following answer: what is required is a fundamental restructuring of society, not only with the redistribution of financial resources, but also a change in the fundamental balance of power. And that is uncomfortable for those who currently hold power and have access to power. And that is why we find that political will is not always as enthusiastic as it needs to be. And that's the power of the Working Group 2 narrative. It's much more uncomfortable and talks to us about how we need to change and how the politics need to change. We need a new social compact between those who have and those who don't, and between us as a human species and the planet we live on. So I think that underscores the fact that this report it's science, but it's more. It's highlighting everywhere that the impacts of climate change are hitting and revealing all the underlying dynamics and circumstances that make those impacts stronger. The report also recognizes the value of diverse forms of knowledge, such as scientific as well as indigenous and local knowledge. It then goes on to say in the chapter on Africa that African indigenous knowledge systems are exceptionally rich in ecosystem-specific knowledge used for management of climate variability. Integration of indigenous knowledge systems within legal frameworks and promotion of indigenous land tenure rights can reduce vulnerability. But as Dr. Roberts also said yesterday at the Presidential Commission, it cannot be top down. You can't sort of lump indigenous knowledge into the same kind of category as scientific knowledge and expect it to be squeezed in and treated the same way. The scientific traditional system wants peer review and, reproducibility and all sorts of kind of principles to be applicable, and those don't fit comfortably with all indigenous knowledge. So indigenous knowledge also needs to be handled in a way that is appropriate for it. So that is obviously a challenge, but something that's very important to bear in mind. Just in terms of terminology, they express different levels of confidence, going from very low, low, medium, high, and very high. That's the scientific confidence in the outcomes or the conclusions being drawn. And then there are also different likelihoods of an outcome or result, going from virtually certain to exceptionally unlikely. So we're going to go through the main findings of the report now. After that, we'll have a look at the findings in relation to Africa, and then a few snippets from South Africa, and then look at what this means for us as activists. Just to give you an idea, this is a page from the summary. So the main headline findings are in that peach box at the top, and then the information that makes up that finding is underneath. So this gives you an idea of how complex the language is. It's not very accessible. And this is the summary. So this in turn is based on the 3,600 pages of the main report. So I guess that's the downside of a really solid scientific collation of information, but it's not necessarily that accessible to a lot of people. They've got great graphs and graphics. This is an example of one, and the reason I'm showing this one is it really looks at how the different systems are coupled together. So ecosystems, climate, and human society. So the whole approach is to look at those as systems that are interdependent on each other and not look at them in silos or isolation. Okay, so these are some of the findings that have come across, and a lot of them are fairly obvious and sound like they're stating the obvious. But again, these have now been found through a 5-year process of reviewing the literature to be true and to be more true than they were thought to be previously. So extreme weather events and their losses and damages to nature and people are happening beyond natural climate variability. So in other words, the linkage to global warming, to climate change is even more strongly recognized. Some adaptation has reduced vulnerability, and the most vulnerable people and systems that are vulnerable for other reasons are disproportionately affected. There have been some irreversible impacts as human and natural systems are pushed beyond their ability to adapt. The socioeconomic development of different groupings is very much a factor in how vulnerable different groupings are, and is also influenced by unsustainable ocean and land use, inequity, marginalization, historical and ongoing patterns of inequity such as colonialism and governance. 3.3 to 3.6 billion people live in contexts that are highly vulnerable to climate change. A high proportion of non-human species are vulnerable to climate change, and human and ecosystem vulnerability are interdependent. So this interdependence is becoming recognized more and more. Near-term actions that would limit global warming to close to 1.5 degrees would substantially reduce projected losses and damages, but cannot eliminate them all. So this message is reinforced quite a few times through the report. It's really important that we do try and attain that 1.5 degree warming limit, because the impacts and dangers do escalate dramatically beyond that level. Identified key risks and mid and long-term impacts are multiple times higher than currently observed. So in other words, what we're seeing as impacts now don't steadily increase, that as we move beyond 2040, etc., they start to increase dramatically. And what we do in terms of mitigation, where we manage to keep the warming limited to, does play a big impact. But we need to be aware that in the mid and long term, these impacts are very likely going to grow, depending on how well we manage the mitigation side of things. And every increment of warming increases the losses and damages. The impacts and risks are becoming increasingly complex and more difficult to manage. Many of these hazards occur simultaneously, and they interact with each other, creating a compounding effect. So, one thing starts going wrong in the system, and it starts to interact with other aspects that are going wrong, and the risks then start to become dramatically higher. If the warming exceeds 1.5 degrees in the coming decades, then many human and natural systems will face additional severe risks compared to remaining below the 1.5. So here that element is being emphasized once again. And then some of the impacts, if we do overshoot, will cause release of additional greenhouse gases, and some of this will be irreversible. So an example is we obviously heating up the atmosphere, we're melting permafrost in the Arctic zones. That is causing a release of methane, which in turn then increases the global warming. So our warming is creating more warming. And as we go over 1.5, that becomes even more intense. So what adaptation there has been observed across all sectors and regions, and it has generated benefits, but it is unevenly distributed. And I think this came out in the commission chats again yesterday, is that a lot of adaptation happens where the money goes and what is where the political attention is being paid. So it's not necessarily going to all the places that it needs to. And a strong focus on immediate and near-term risk reduction can reduce the opportunity for transformational adaptation. So in other words, you could be putting a fix on one of the issues now, but that might prevent the necessary deeper transformation that can actually result in long-term well-being. The effectiveness of the adaptation decreases with increased warming, and solutions that address social inequities increase the feasibility and effectiveness of adaptation. So in other words, equity and some of these other factors that we spoke about, marginalization, the whole issue of where the money goes, really makes a difference in terms of how effective the overall adaptation is. Some soft limits to adaptation have been reached, but can be overcome. So soft limits are where it's still physically possible to adapt, but it's not happening because of financial, political, governance, or institutional issues. So in other words, the human response is not lined up to be able to adapt appropriately. But there are also hard limits. That's where the physical world has gone beyond being able to be sorted out in terms of adaptation. So, I mean, areas that are desertifying, or coral reefs that are bleaching, that cannot come back to life. Those are hard limits. So there's no more adapting to those. Those one is going to have to live around some way. It's the soft limits that we can still address. Maladaptation has also been recognized. So this is adaptation measures which might seem like a good idea at the time, but turn out not to be, in that they cause other problems down the line. Examples given are seawalls, which might sort sea level rise out in a local place for a point in time, but those walls can then cause flooding in other regions. So it looks like sound adaptation looked through a narrow lens, but if you look at the big picture, it was actually not a good idea. So maladaptation can be avoided, again, by flexible and inclusive long-term planning. So this issue of inclusivity comes up a lot. So here again, we can see that this report and the ways in which we can adapt appropriately can be a roadmap to a more socially just, environmentally just, economically just world moving forward. So to enable what we need, certain things need to be in place, such as political commitment and follow through, sound institutional frameworks, policies and instruments with clear goals and priorities, enhanced knowledge on impacts and solutions, mobilization of and access to adequate financial resources, monitoring and evaluation, and inclusive governance processes. So reviewing all these papers, they've got high confidence that these are the kinds of things we need to be able to respond appropriately. The impacts, risks, and vulnerabilities are more urgent than they were in the fifth assessment report. So this kind of follows a trend as these reports get released in the different cycles. You can almost bank on it that the science is telling us the situation is more severe than it was thought to be. Certainly, we haven't seen that trend reverse. Then climate resilient development is facilitated by international cooperation and by governments at all levels working with communities, with civil society, with educational bodies, with scientific and other institutions, with media, with investors, and with business. So in other words, everybody needs to be on board with this. And the better the collaboration and cooperation is between these different sectors and different stakeholders, the more effective and more integrated the climate response can be. Partnerships need to be developed with traditionally marginalized groups, including women, youth, indigenous people, local communities, and ethnic minorities. And the way to do that, according to the report, is to enable political leadership, so political leadership that actually pursues these partnerships and makes them happen, institutions doing the same, resources including finance, as well as climate services, information, and decision support tools. So a big area that's been identified is that we need a lot of information on what is happening with the climate, with weather. What can we be expecting? That these tools need to be widely available, they need to be democratically accessible, etc., to allow everybody to make the decisions they need to make. If you think that these climate risks and impacts affect everybody needs to be sufficiently empowered to know what is going on and to plan for themselves. So yes, there needs to be centralized planning and organization and tools and resources, but at the same time, from the bottom up, people need to be empowered, and these tools and access to information have been very clearly identified as being able to enable that. The urban environment and cities have been focused on quite substantially in the report. There is this global trend of urbanization, which can cause problems, but it's also opportunity to be able to adapt soundly and ensure climate resilient development. And for that, we need integrated and inclusive planning and investment in everyday decision-making about urban infrastructure, including social, ecological, and grey or physical infrastructure. So grey infrastructure, as referred to in the report, means your built infrastructure, your walls, your stormwater drains, etc., etc. The ecological infrastructure, more your nature-based solutions, wetlands, mangroves, whatever the case may be, and how these can be enhanced to increase the adaptive capacity of human settlements. And then coastal cities and settlements play a very important role in this. So the sea level rise is locked in. We discussed this at the last assessment report release. At best for South Africa, we, for example, looking at around 60 centimeters by the end of the century, going up to a meter, but looking at 2, 5, 10, and 15 meters in the coming centuries. So no matter what we do, if we stopped emissions right now, sea level rise would be happening for the next few thousand years. So that sort of mid to long-term planning around coastal settlements is something that needs to be engaged with. And obviously, if that is done correctly, that can also play an important role. Although, as you can imagine, some really big decisions need to be made around that. Biodiversity and ecosystems, so they are fundamental to climate resilience, and they need to be safeguarded. And they play different roles. So maintaining the resilience of the biodiversity and the ecosystem in the report, or a number of reports have said that needs the effective and equitable conservation of 30 to 50% of Earth's land, freshwater, and ocean areas. So in other words, keep potentially up to half of the nature on the planet in that form. That, it's obviously questionable how realistic that is and what that means, traditional approaches to conservation are not necessarily socially just in all cases, but certainly we need to keep a lot of the ecosystem services intact and probably spend a lot of time regenerating those that have been damaged. So this emphasizes the urgency. Again, a lot of the choices and actions implemented in the next decade will determine the extent to which the medium and long-term pathways will deliver higher or lower climate resilient development. So again, this is just emphasizing what the previous reports have said and what the 1.5 degree report from 2019 has said. This is the decade for action. And this is the kind of urgency we don't see in the necessary courts necessarily, depending on who we're talking to, but certainly much of the business sector and much of government does not appear to be addressing these issues with this level of urgency. If we do the next 10 years well, then we make life a lot easier for ourselves for the time after that. If we don't do anything, or we're inadequate with our actions, we're really going to pay the price down the line. This again emphasizes the 1.5 degree warming, and basically says that the way we've conducted ourselves in the past with our governance, with our development, with our emissions, we are constraining our abilities to thrive in the future. And this is the last line of the summary, or the last little paragraph. And it basically says any further delay in concerted global action will miss a brief and rapidly closing window for opportunity to secure a livable and sustainable future for all. So that's been in a lot of the headlines and a lot of the media, but it's just reaffirming what the whole report says, and that is really that we've got a small window of opportunity and we need to act now. Another one of the cartoons, which are sort of funny and sort of disturbing. So looking a little bit at Africa quickly. So this report doesn't delve into national level, so it won't deal with countries specifically, but it speaks to regions, and Africa obviously gets its own chapter. Africa has already suffered biodiversity loss, water shortages, reduced food production, loss of lives, and reduced economic growth. And if we warm between 1.5 and 2, then we can expect widespread and severe reduced food production again, reduced economic growth, increased inequality and poverty, biodiversity loss, pressure on water, and increased human morbidity and mortality. If we do limit warming to 1.5, the report says that we can expect to substantially reduce the damages to 14 African economies and ecosystems. So adaptation generally is cost effective. So what this means is it's a lot cheaper to spend the money on adapting than it is to spend the money on sorting out the damages if we don't adapt. So as expensive as it is, it still makes economic sense. And this is where long-term thinking is really critical, and what is sadly lacking from our current political and commercial system, where short-term thinking seems to rule the day. Finance flows targeting adaptation for Africa are billions of US dollars less than they need to be, than even the lowest adaptation cost estimates. So the report tends to shy away from giving numbers when it makes statements like this. I think that's perhaps a different field of expertise, but it is saying that finance is way inadequate. It's not been targeted for more vulnerable countries. So the most vulnerable countries are probably getting very little or nothing. Again, just highlighting the injustice of the current system. And shows here that from 2014 to 2018, for example, more of the financial commitments were debt rather than grants. So we often sold this as being climate aid and assistance, but really it's a different form of loans, debts, and the countries basically find themselves getting more indebted and really in a worse position. And of 43 commitments that were made, for example, only 46% of that money has actually been paid out. So this is a real big issue, this finance issue. And We'll raise it again just now when we talk about what the activists need to do about this report. Governance is a really big issue. It comes up time and time again. And the barriers, this is in Africa, although this relates to many of the other regions as well. Barriers include slow policy implementation progress. I think we can vouch for that ourselves. Incoherent and fragmented approaches. So really what they're saying is that sound climate response needs to be an all of government approach, and that this is not happening. And this is one of the worries that we have with the current climate change bill, is does it adequately ensure that there's a coherent and integrated approach? Inadequate governance systems to manage climate finance, poor stakeholder participation, that can sometimes be by design, as we know. And sometimes stakeholders are not sufficiently empowered enough to understand, to be able to participate properly, and perhaps there's apathy as well. Gender inequalities, unaligned development and climate agendas. This one we also know about, elite capture of climate governance systems, hierarchical and complex bureaucracy, and weak or non-existent or fragmented subnational institutions. Here we have to think in our context of local government, who are going to play such an important role, especially with climate adaptation. Do they have what they need? Are they strong enough? Are they resourced? So for good governance, the report suggests long-term planning, this all-of-government approach. Very important transboundary cooperation and benefit sharing. So looking at things on a regional level. So as much as things need to happen at municipal level, in Southern Africa, ourselves, Botswana, Namibia, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, also need to be looking, we share river basins, and there needs to be a transboundary approach. We need development pathways that increase adaptation and mitigation. And very importantly, NDC implementation. We need to make our Paris Agreement target commitments happen, because that also feeds into sound governance and makes the whole effort more effective. And then the unequal power relations between the global north and south are also identified as being an issue. Ecosystem approaches to adaptation, very important. There's a lot of high direct human dependence on ecosystem services in Africa, and the protection and restoration of those ecosystems, conservation, agriculture, sustainable land management, and integrated catchment management can support climate resilience very strongly. And these ecosystem approaches to adaptation cost less than grey infrastructure, than the steel and concrete infrastructure that gets used. And examples given are wetlands and mangroves as coastal protection. Agroecology and diversification of agricultural practices is also identified to increase resilience and sustainability of food systems. And gender-sensitive and equity-based adaptation approaches also reduce vulnerability. Migration is a big issue. So most of that happens within countries or between neighboring countries at this point in time. And urbanization has been shown to increase when low rainfall or drought periods happen. Over 2.6 to 3.4 million weather-related displacements occurred in 2018 and 2019. That's a big amount of people. And if we warm at 1.7 degrees, between 17 and 40 million people could migrate internally in sub-Saharan Africa, and that could go up to 86 million at 2.5 degrees. So those are phenomenal movements of population, and you can imagine what kind of consequences could come from that. In terms of conflict, so there is evidence that link increased temperatures and drought to conflict in Africa. The report does point out that, there are many other factors, but certainly climate could have one. And that politically excluded groups are especially vulnerable to conflict risk. Excuse me. And that what can be done is ameliorating or reducing ethnic tensions as much as possible, and strengthening political institutions to help manage this risk of conflict. And here again, it talks about a cross-sectoral approach, really dealing with this issue from every possible angle, and gives examples how climate change adaptation would, for example, benefit pandemic preparedness. It talks of the One Health approach, which looks at human and ecosystem health as part of the same thing. And we've already mentioned how ecosystem-based adaptation can deliver both adaptation and mitigation, which is something that needs to be looked at. And again, warning about this maladaptation, and give some examples. For example, says that maintaining indigenous forest benefits biodiversity, but afforestation, so planting forests in the wrong places, can harm water security and biodiversity. So you don't want to be planting trees where there's meant to be grassland. Hydropower, which is a renewable form of energy, can increase risks of risks as rainfall changes happen. So again, one of those things where what appears to be a short-term solution might be a problematic long-term solution. And again, it's having proper planning and inclusive planning that is going to combat that. And then just a few snippets from South Africa. South Africa does feature quite highly in the different chapters. So the one is research saying that housing occupied by poor communities regularly experience indoor temperature fluctuations between 4 and 5 degrees warmer than outdoor temperatures. Another case study was highlighted where over 80% of businesses, formal and informal, lost over 50% of employees and revenue due to agricultural drought, and how tourism has also been affected. And then quite interesting, in one part of the report, it singles out Durban as being quite exemplary in process of engagement and learning, and that it's built trust and capacities needed to form climate resilient decisions. And then in another part, it also highlights how in Durban, local governments rely considerably on shadow systems and informal spaces of information and knowledge exchange across 50 of their operations. So in other words, a lot of the action has happened, a lot of the knowledge is there, but the political will at the highest levels is not necessarily always supportive. It highlights research conducted across 2 municipalities in the Western Cape, showing the importance of a dedicated environmental champion, access to knowledge and the availability of resources, political stability, and the presence of dense social networks. And interestingly, the whole day zero situation in Cape Town features quite highly in the report and is used as a case study in a number of different aspects of the report. So is this an atlas of doom, as the UN Secretary General has suggested, or is it perhaps also a user's guide for action? So the Working Group 1 report, the scientific basis, is quite neat in a sense in that it sort of names all the scientifically proven impacts of climate change, and you can draw some very neat principles. This one's a bit different in that it takes a snapshot approach to some extent of a wide range of happenings. And I think we can see quite clearly that climate change impacts are not necessarily very different from other socially problematic impacts or economically problematic impacts. The climate change issue just makes them worse, and they in turn make climate response worse. So it's very much interwoven. But what is good is we can look at what the findings in this report are and see where the problem areas are. And that helps us focus on what it is that we can do. So as activists, what is it, this is something we can discuss jointly, but looking at the key findings from here and what is it that we can focus on? What is it that we really need to demand and engage around. And finance is obviously one. We need to talk about grants instead of more debt. The developed world has pledged $100 billion for adaptation assistance. That was meant to start being paid in 2020. It hasn't started being paid yet, and they've deferred that to, I think, 2025. So they're just not doing what they said in terms of providing that money. Loss and damage. So I mean, that's money that comes from actual damages that have been suffered as a result of climate impacts. Thinking of the flood in Mozambique as just one example. And the developed nations are steadfastly refusing to make good those promises around paying loss of damage. So that's something that needs to be demanded. And then we also heard yesterday, a lot of the finance that's available goes to mitigation and very little to adaptation. So there need to be demands that more finance flows to adaptation. Actual mitigation, reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, implementing our NDCs helps us with adaptation, as we've seen those linkages get made. The One Health system, where we see human and ecosystem health as being one and the same. The economics, those are fundamentally, I think many of us can feel that at odds with the sound climate response. In a sense, adapting to climate change in many regards doesn't make anyone any money, and that's why it doesn't happen. That's one of the problems. So as I mentioned earlier, in the full report, this issue of degrowth was named a number of times as being a potential adaptation solution, and that's the intentional decrease of GDP linked to greenhouse gas emissions. It doesn't seem like the political will is very strong behind that, but it's interesting to me anyway to see that this kind of thinking comes in at these levels. And then governance, just to reiterate those problems around governance, the fragmentation, the poor participation, elite capture and corruption, and weak fragmented subnational institutions. These are some of the things that I believe as civil society we need to be shouting about quite loudly, doing advocacy work on to make sure that the right governance is in place, that we can actually respond and avoid literal death and damage down the line. And then here's another one of those cartoons. And it's both funny and not funny. And yeah, that's the material. So we can have a discussion. I can hopefully answer any questions that you might have and see what to do with this alarming and somewhat hopeful information as well. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Brandon. I think that gave us a very good starting point. So we have a few minutes for questions, at least 10, but we can potentially go over time a little bit. So if you have something you'd like to either contribute or a question you'd like to ask specifically to Brandon or to the room, please just raise your hand and then we will make a lineup. And you should just be able to unmute yourselves. Also, just a reminder that we are recording the session and we are currently live on Facebook. So don't say anything you don't want the world to know. Okay. David, go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Brandon. That was great. And it's nice to see that a number of those points reflect what we've been kind of pushing in terms of the open agenda and stuff like that, including transfers to impoverished people. In other words, a big, in our case anyway, and the stuff around rebasing the way that we think about economies. Just a note. I gather that there are three major points of contention during the review of the short version, the SPM, the version for policymakers, and those were around the inclusion of loss and damage. Obviously, the northern countries that didn't want too much said about that lost on that particular thing, which is kind of unusual. And I think loss and damage was something that came through from, I think it started in Doha, which was the year after Durban. And then a few years after that, there was a Warsaw committee or something like that. Yeah, so the whole discourse around loss and damage there's been a lot of that discourse has grown considerably over those years. Another point of contention apparently related to nature-based solutions as opposed to ecosystem-based whatevers. But I think that specifically relates to, from our point of view anyway, to the use of nature-based solutions in carbon offsetting, in other words, in carbon trading and stuff like that. And that politics is going to be quite big this year, as a consequence of COP26 coming to a decision on market and non-market mechanisms, which was pretty appalling. And then the finance stuff that Brandon's kind of emphasized, and I think obviously finance is always going to be in the middle of the contestation from here on between North and South, because basically the North do not want to admit liability for their historic emissions, etc., etc. And I gather that the exclusion of the numbers on how much money was actually going into adaptation was basically along those kinds of north-south lines of contestation in the review of the SPM. So that's me.
Thanks, David. Yeah, I mean, I think we're seeing the same theme in a number of those points that you raised, and I think the loss and damage issues is incrementally moving forward, hopefully. But once there's a mechanism in place, it really closes the door on the sort of historical polluters anyway to avoid liability, and it's kind of, it gets very real in dollars and cents terms. I think we would do well, all of us, to sort of understand this whole issue of nature-based solutions and ecosystem solutions better, because I think you alluded to the fact that it's an area that's hugely open to abuse. Planting plantations to wood chip them, to burn them, to make energy is kind of being sold as a renewable energy, and there's no way that it is. But at the same time, regenerating natural wetlands and that kind of thing really is, and I think provides a lot of scope also for employment. Interestingly, the Working for Water program that was launched here in, I think, 2008 was singled out in this report as being an example of quite a successful adaptation measure. And I think the scope for things like that, particularly maybe in the Mpumalanga Highveld, are potentially quite high. So that's something to also keep an eye on. Any other questions or thoughts? Tim?
Brandon, thanks so much for the presentation. Much appreciated. Just keen to get your and others' initial thoughts around using this latest report as a basis for the adaptation arm within our climate change bill campaign that we're developing. I mean, something that's striking that we've flagged before is we can't afford to wait for the climate change bill when it comes to mitigation and adaptation and resilience decisions that need to be made today. And I wonder if there's already an opportunity here to use this as a base document along with our drawing it down along with our national climate change adaptation strategy, which among other things has an implementation plan within it as the sort of operative tool. But using these documents to distill 3 to 5 key facts about what we are facing and what we're projected to face in terms of harms, especially the distinction between the 1.5 and 2 degree scenarios. And then also maybe 3 to 5 priority demands, urgent demands around adaptation actions or decisions that need to be taken now in current. I mean, obvious concern. Well, we've flagged the finance issue and allocation, and then also the fact that we've got this national climate change adaptation strategy. Yes, a very high level document, but there's certainly some actionable content in there, it's definitely not filtering down into local government among other tiers, in terms of their integrated development plans, etc., and current day decisions. So I don't know if you've got any immediate thoughts around how we can sort of adopt this information into our climate change bill campaign.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, I think there's a lot of sort of general principles that are highlighted in there, which can be very useful and used in a number of different ways. I think it obviously doesn't drill down into country-specific findings, so it's a bit short on some of the real meaty data that might be useful with something like that. Yeah, and I think, I mean, as you've rightly said, I think we can't wait for what the kind of timeframes in the climate change bill are, and somehow need to get it going. So I think helpful, but not necessarily that helpful. And I think that'll be a bit of an ongoing thing to distill some of those things. But we probably need a lot more kind of really good homegrown data to drive some of that work as well. I don't know if anyone else has got any thoughts around this. It'll also be really good, I think, Tim, to follow on a bit, is just to really map what is being done, because I do see claims being made about most of the metros having kind of adaptation plans and response plans in place. So it looks like some of them may be ahead of what is kind of prescribed in the bill. And just to really get a good idea of, at metro level at least, who's doing what and how far advanced are they and how sound are those plans? Are they realistic? David?
Yeah, just on how sound those plans are. I mean, in Durban, okay, so Deborah got applauded in the report for the work that's been done in Durban, but when it actually comes to having the next flood or whatever, we have lots of people dying. We have roads flooded with from blocked up drains. We have sewage and the emptying out into the bay. So whatever the hell Deborah's doing in her department, that sure as hell ain't getting through to any other department in the metro. And I think that's the absence of what they'd like to see in terms of joined up government, etc., goes down through all the levels of government from national down to local. Yeah, so I mean, there are various projects around, some of which we would probably think of as maladaptation, others of which we'd think, well, that's really necessary. But yeah, I mean, you know, there's a thing down the Ambila River, which was meant to be one of the targets of eThekwini's kind of climate adaptation and biodiversity efforts, and that got swept away with a whole bunch of toxic stuff in some flood or other. So yeah, I mean, I think a lot of these things are really difficult.
Thanks, David. Yeah, I think again, maybe pointing to the disconnect between different levels or actors within government, and pointing to the issue of political will. Okay, I think we've hit the 2 o'clock mark. So given that it's a brown bag and it's supposed to be over our lunch period, I think we could leave it there, but certainly, yeah, certainly something for consideration. And I think adaptation is something that we are increasingly going to need to be looking at. So thank you all.
Thank you so much,
back to you.
Yeah, thanks so much for all the time you've put into preparing this and for leading us in this discussion. I think let's keep it in mind as we go ahead and continue these discussions around what do we do now. I think that slide at the end is a very good kind of briefing starting point for us. If you wouldn't mind maybe sending me the slides and I will circulate them to everyone.
Sure.
And yeah, thank you so much everyone for joining in.
Great, thank you. Tim, won't you put that link that you did to that to that thing on WhatsApp?
Yeah, sure, Dave. I'll do that now.
Great, thanks. Ciao.
Thanks, Brandon.
Everyone.
Thanks,
Have
everyone.
a lovely weekend.
Cheers.
Cheers. Bye-bye.